Good morning. As we begin Unit 5 focuses on reform movements of the early 19th century or the early 1800s. So, the first thing that we have to cover is religious reform, known as the Second Great Awakening. So 1812 marks the beginning of a war against the British. So after the war is over and we move into what's known as the era of good feelings, we're going to see major efforts at religious revival. So already you are aware of how the 13 colonies were established and how many of them were established for religious purposes in places like New England, in places like Maryland, and in places like Pennsylvania. But we're going to see this second awakening that begins in Western Kentucky. And what these awakenings were was you had traveling preachers that would travel from state to state around the country, giving religious speeches. People would be overtaken, they would faint, they would do all these things. So, our lesson objectives today, we can explain the Second Great Awakening, and you can also describe how, as we see the arrival of new immigrants to the United States, we'll see other religions get established and they will be discriminated against, like Mormons, Catholics, as well as Jewish people. So the Second Great Awakening profoundly influenced American life. Membership in churches skyrocketed across the nation. And what happens is these religious feelings that were reawakened then will shift Americans to work for a more wider variety of social reform. We'll be covering different social reform movements in lesson 2. So the Second Great Awakening we can define as the religious revival movement in the first half of the 1800s. A revivalist was a preacher who works to renew the importance of religion in American life. So even though in America with our First Amendment we have the right to practice religion however we want, this is where we begin to see a shift of large portions of the American public being extremely religious. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Second Great Awakening begins on the frontier in Kentucky and then spreads north and south, reaching the cities of the Northeast in the 1820s. And you basically, these preachers would publish things in newspapers, they would publish pamphlets, and then they would travel around, almost like a celebrity would travel around today, or you would go see a concert of some kind. Just look at the picture on the top left, right? One person, kind of a one-man show with large numbers of people listening to them. So there were hundreds of preachers that were like this, notably Charles Granson Finney, and they would set up camps in rural areas, attracting thousands of converts throughout the country. The people who were converted would become so frenzied listening to these people speak. They would roll, jerk, shake, bark, faint, like all the things when you think of more revivalist, and there are certain Protestant religions where it's very common to like act out to show that you're like accepting the message of God. And this kind of becomes known as the beginning of the evangelical movement, where a style of worship elicits or causes very powerful emotions. So this was not just white Americans. African Americans also embraced this Second Great Awakening. Many preachers welcomed African Americans at their revivals, but African Americans also used this as an opportunity to establish their own separate churches. In 1816, several of these churches unified or united together to become the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME for short, which is still in existence today. By 1826, the AME Church had nearly 8,000 members. So here is a tray, a painting tray that shows a Congregationalist minister, Lemuel Haynes, in 1785. He was probably the first African American to be ordained by a mainstream Protestant church, which means he was, able to preach to a majority white audience. We also see new religious groups form. The Mormons, also known as the Church of Latter-day Saints, was founded by Ohioan Joseph Smith in 1830. Mormons predominantly believe that God had entrusted them with a new set of scriptures called the Book of Mormon. But also, as part of the Mormon religion, They advocated polygamy. Polygamy means having more than one spouse. In this case, many Mormon men would be married to multiple wives. Mormons faced intense hostility and persecution from Protestants throughout the Midwest because of this practice. It was not legal, so they were actually somewhat breaking the law. So they were kind of targeted because of this. If you ever watch like TLC shows like Sister Wives and stuff, those are people that practice the Mormon religion today that are practicing polygamy, which, again, as I said, is not legal. So we saw violence break out against Mormons. The Mormons are kind of forced to constantly move. So when they arrive in Illinois from Ohio, Joseph Smith is murdered. So another follower of the Mormon religion named Brigham Young takes charge of the church, and he says, you know what, if people don't want us here, let's go west. So they lead a mass migration to the desert around the Great Salt Lake in today what is modern day Utah. If you go to Utah today, Brigham Young University is named after Brigham Young. There are still lots of people that practice the Mormon religion in Utah today, as well as other parts of the country as well. So the Mormons, once they get to Utah, converted the barren lands into an oasis suitable for growing crops. Utah did not become a state until 1896 because they had to agree to abandon the practice of polygamy. They would not be allowed to be admitted to the United States as a state until they outlawed it. But as I mentioned, even though it's outlawed, does not mean that there are not still some that practice it today. So this map just shows the migration of how they kind of started and had to slowly move west out into the Salt Lake City. So you also have the formation of the Unitarian Church that sees God as one being instead of the traditional three beings that we see in the Protestant and the Catholic Church, and they created their own church based on these ideas. As we see immigration rise from parts of Europe, we see an increase in Catholics, especially from Ireland. They are facing their potato famine, and we also see Jewish people from Eastern and Central Europe immigrating to the country. So they will also face discrimination. Why they face discrimination, Catholics and Catholicism as a religion was looked at as incompatible with the American ideas of democracy, that Catholics would do what the church told them to do and not what the country would do. The Catholic Church is led by the Pope, who's in the Vatican City in Italy. So Americans and Protestants believed that Catholics would only listen to what the Pope said and not, what a government said, what the president said. Poor Irish Catholics also will face discrimination as they arrive here. They had little money, so they would work for extremely low wages, which threatened other workers. So think of it as like a lot of what you see in current events today, how people target immigrants and how, they'll work these menial jobs and they're stealing our jobs. And it's all the same things that Americans have said throughout our country's history. It's very similar. So we also have Jewish people facing discrimination. Until late in the 19th century, Jews were barred from holding political office in many parts of the United States, but that will change as we move into the 1900s. So again, Protestants, which were the majority religion in the United States, kind of saw these two groups as being the opposite of what America was all about. So that is why they would face discrimination. So the Second Great Awakening kind of increased religious fervor in the United States. And then we'll look at in the next lesson, you're going to do a little project on different reform movements that came out of this Second Great Awakening.